And that was the 1969 hit, The Necromancy of the Blues. That's all we have time for, and I want to thank my guest Aubrey Shagg, who is, as we have heard, a noted authority on British psychedelic blues legends Spike Fungus Huggins and Derek Fried Egg Trumpington. You're listening to Despair FM on E7 Con Moderato, and now for the next episode of our thriller, from the case files of hard-bitten sleuth Jake Hatchett in Blue Walker, Black Dog. No one had an angle on Blue Walker. The man of 1,000 faces with no features at all. He was only known as a juju man who took names and took souls. Rumor had it he had been released from somewhere, or had escaped.
Was this Florentine a foreign theme, or was it home? What to make of these compass points? Was I reborn, relocated, dislocated to somewhere new, where I knew not where I roamed and had forgot where was home? Would using this map prove a trap, which would have me canned in this new no man's land, where I had wandered unplanned, penned in this open delta fen, never to reach the realm of the true phantom, the blues bantam of the dirt road with no area code, and to know that no path led back to my hearth? What was sound ground? Could sound be ground you could walk on? Was slide guitar a gladed path through a lonely dearth? To Socrates, he of the philosophies, writing was graven in stone. Conversational dialogue was graven on the soul, had room to grow in dialogue's ebb and flow. In the same way, Christ protested to the priests when he preached in Jerusalem that their ideas were made inflexible in their adherence to the letter of the law, as it is phrased in the King James Bible, and as a black person in the South fed the need to read during Patton's life, that text was the principal pretext, the sacred tract for those autodidacts. The anti-cleric heretic of his day, Yeshua Bar Yosef, would have seen elder greens everywhere and cleaved to the poor hordes as somewhere like the Upper Delta, would surely have darkened the doors of exactly the kind of dens of ill fame where the blues ran the game. Helena, Arkansas, where the bluffs soar above the flatlands, was a hot spot for the Delta players to schmooze and start bands. Willie Brown's solid sides abided with Patton's sound, bass snap resound and vocal convoluted of this reputed player, essayer not of the Delta blues, but student of the blueprint, the original mint, who had outgrown his teachers to become one himself. On the whole, it was alcohol which would take its toll on Brown's rock and roll. A welter of Delta players would jink to the brink with the demon drink. Tommy Johnson was similarly controlled. Was that the part of his soul he had sold? For Tommy Johnson's tale to tell his brother Liddell was of a deal with hell, which he made to play well. That was the law of the crossroads, before it was linked to Robert Johnson, whose crossroad blues would shriek up through diabolic chimney flues, but would make no reference to a Mephistophelian lean. Booker White recorded for Victor in Memphis, 1930. His national steel barked delightful bright slide whose rhythmic whack echoed the clickety-clack of the trains in his veins. His talking blues flowed like a Mississippi MC from the 30s. The wheels spun on Wheeler Ford's Buick after it picked up 4 passengers, Charlie Patton and his inamorata, keys monster Louise Johnson, his sideman Willie Brown, and Eddie Son House, expert tractor driver and lay sermonizer, a late convert to the blues who had been getting around and wowed crowds with his extraordinary sound, and who had been recommended by Patton, ever generous to his mates. To Grafton they drove and strove to get along, but feelings were strong. Son House had pleased Louise and she was gone into his arms. Squaring off on the verge, Charlie fell backward and made matchwood of his new Stella. And Lemons, Citron's siren ghost put the squeeze, had Son House trying to please by working up a Jefferson-style tune in his room. He adapted Lemon's hit, See That My Grave Is Kept Clean, to compose Mississippi County Farm Blues, a song he would re-record in the 40s, a fear-racked track which harked back to the dread Parchman Farm pen, where harm came and the chains rained again, but who spurned in turn sung refrains to blow out your brains. Son House shows Patton's influence in the primal Preachin' the Blues, his signature tune, a sardonic story with a Pentecostal delivery. The bass snap and treble stab harks back to Patton's sublime When Your Way Gets Dark and Magnolia Blues. For all this, Son House has a capability and personalised style which leaps full-grown and alone from the speaker cone. While ensconced in Wisconsin, Patton and Brown put down some duets from which we get a real sense of the frenetic music of the juke joint. Through them, we get to eavesdrop on the frolics and flops which made Patton the top dog of the Delta Bog. The vocal asides, the timing's divergence and deviation, the sense of exhilaration, inebriation. Louise Johnson's blues shout and two-fisted, cascading barrel-house piano added flames to the fire of one of the great country blues sessions of all time. Charlie Patton would then batten down the hatches with Bertha Lee Jones from Lula, who worked as a cook in a white kitchen. He and she would lodge in Holly Ridge. Son House and Charlie Patton both played the medicine shows, as did many other blues players of the period, such as contemporary Paramount star Blind Willie McTell, the genial genius from Georgia who delved in with a 12-string, and in the name of the snake oil traders' humbuggery, the medicine shows brought a panoply of entertainers to them, with satellite sideshows adding to the mixture. There was Hunt's Remedy, Kickapoo Salve, there were gargling tonics and crystals too, to save you from chronic flatus or flu, where hymns and ballads were equally mocked, where the poor and illiterate eagerly flocked with backs crooked or faces pocked to pick up a panacea from the dubious stock, because who could afford a trip to the dock? But what ghost came in all this bliss? What stooge lived in the grooves and came through? The one which lives in the difference between the sum of the parts and the whole thing, which revolves. No Kickapoo Salve to solve this itchy coo park of dark. The god of the open goal, which none can score in, no matter how much they pour in. The stare, when returned, will be spurned. Petrifying eyes will burn until you are turned into black cat bone. And you are not alone. No, you are not alone anymore. You pushed at the door. You will never be alone anymore, you reckless whore. In 31, the rising sun went to the gun. The Japanese breezed into Manchuria. The beleaguered League of Nations was furious, they said, but didn't want to water the bed of war, so they kind of stared at the floor as the delegation made for the door. The slow fuse was fired of the Sino-Japanese War, a wasteful and savage death spiral, which was to unfold concurrent with war's purulence in the Pacific. And in 31 too, through H.C. Spear, another great appeared, Nehemiah Skip James, who mastered the darker and lonelier Bentonia sound, the minor key tunings and high devilish croonings. Skip James was the Carlos Montoya of Paranoia. I'm so glad, sounding stark mad. If Petey Wheatstraw was the High Sheriff of Hell, then at least here was the infernal Attorney General. Wheatstraw had gone before by the devil's son-in-law and was a player who showed the cleaner and smoother urban style which was being compiled, mainly by southern economic exiles to enrich the cultural cargo of cities like Chicago. At a typically alcoholic frolic in Holly Ridge, 33, there was a violent spree. During the bash, Charlie got his throat slashed. His shoes were splashed. Almost exactly a year before, Charlie Patton would record his last session on Manhattan after Il Duce's Patton in Germany, a mad hatter whose patter had charmed and persuaded had finally, totally, fatefully made it. Racial oration provided the nation the old notion that if one race was lame, others were to blame. And for that one to flourish, another had to perish. Hitler and his stenching plenipotentiaries would soon set to drenching the century in blood. But there was red already, a gusher in Russia, beset by the submerged funeral dirges of the purges.
I figured what walks like a man must be a man, but Blue Walker left no readable trail at all. I turned up nothing but false leads, tall tales, and loose talk. A possible meeting at the cemetery came to nothing and had me spooked. My chin was right out in the breeze. That Blue Walker stitched me up, had me watched, acting as a free agent deep in Hound Dog Black's territory. Had my name been handed to the Undertaker, my dossier on this shadow man, Walker, was a shrug wrapped up in a wallet file.
By 1934, Charlie Patton's pattern of living had become unforgiving of the congenital heart weakness he nursed, and he gradually got worse. Paramount Records had folded in 32, but other labels sought his fabled blues. ARC, the American record company, owned the Vocalion label, and in 34, Vocalion were more keen to get a pre-sold recording star like Patton to the platters. Sales mattered. and units would hopefully start shifting now the depression was lifting. In January, W.R. Calloway's search was underway for the formidable blues player who, after peeling back the layers, he located incarcerated in Belzoni Jail, where Calloway supplied bail and fare by rail, and so Charlie and Bertha Lee, who he would pick to accompany, took a train to grapple with the Big Apple, where, the year before, an infuriated animated ape had escaped, climbed the Empire State irate, and been slain by planes. Patton's crackling fire of 34 was lesser than before, but invention was still richly seeded in a series of recordings which were mainly a recap of musical themes and devices, along with some new songs of a gentler style. The admonishments from her in Bertha Lee's lead Yellow Bee about his wanderlust and wonderlust shine a little light on some of the uneasy dynamics of an attachment to this fading legend of the Delta. At no point in his life did Charlie seem to realise for any stretch of time the dreams he espoused of a plum good home, forever to roam, the fellow with the Stella and the dusting of loam. Poor me is valedictory, hailing a last adieu to leave his fair brown blue. 34 Blues accuses the year, and Charlie's fears had solid peers as to what 34 had in store. On the fiery Revenue Man Blues, old Patton slaps and recaps the old Patton following screaming and hollering anew, under thundered out lyrics with wit and clout. Another side which shines from the session was the bated breath of Oh Death. Charlie confides time's homicide. With drama and beauty, he and Bertha Lee had captured the foreshadowing of his end. 3 months after Patton's valedictory vocalion session, Bertha Lee was history, and he had a new common law called Willie, when the time he felt was not long in the song was not long, when he laid up in his dying bed on the Heathman Dedham plantation. A prayer was appointed, and his lips anointed. The remarkable, rambling roustabout rested, his spectacular dexterous guitar, though stilled in life, could live yet, and by the stylus beguile us, along with the other great artists of this blossoming scene, who were recorded, afforded to the future, time's hemorrhage sutured. Patton's pattern was to fatten in perpetuity. The Vocalion label was the stallion in the stable for Race Records. They got Bessie Smith on board, and in 36 would mix classic tracks in Texas by committing Robert Johnson to wax. The same year, Olympic gold medalist Jesse Owens showed the unsmiling masters of the master race who was faster. The year of civil war in Spain. No pasará, the slogan ran, but the fascist panjandrum overran them. Amid the mortification of the land, Lorca was slaughtered out of hand. Once bitten, Britain and France looked askance at taking a stance. Across the world, the evil scene was begat, the blood let set. European civilization's second blunder was like the first, but far worse by land, sea and air. From hate's pervasion came invasion, persecution, annihilation. France fell and the Brits ran like hell, but Goering was erring and no ego was clouding Dowding as the Spitfires spat and the hurricanes blew. And the rising sun unfurled to whirl over a pearl in Hawaii. and the world was hurled deeper into the hurly-burly. Admiral Yamamoto's sleeping giant filled with a deadly resolve as Franklin D called out a symphony of infamy and looked on as Nippon ripped on, terrific through the Pacific. Alan Lomax of the Library of Congress, as the 40s turned and war burned, would lurk with John Work in the South's shady glades to pick up the folk music played, would record songs and monologues from Parchman Farm, and featured some of the harrowing transcripts in his book, The Land Where the Blues Began. Lomax also recorded Sun House for the Library of Congress. The Jinx Blues takes Charlie's Maggie theme for a jagged scheme, a dazzling piece of proto-rock and roll with the vocal gauntly haunting. Anglo-American bomber forces rumbled over their bases amid the tumbled cottages, the hedges, sedge and sludge of the farmland of East Anglia. These skies are haunted by great piston-powered ghosts of that time, who homed on Cromer on the coast before turning for their deadly flights by day and night. War's spite without respite, high dudgeon's bludgeon. Sally B, that buxom old bird, still whirs over the sward from Duxford, siren symbol of the hordes of US servicemen whose brash charm disarmed the taciturn types they billeted by, and whose brilliant music was a gin and tonic and dominant pastime among the limeys. There were many professional musicians in the ranks of Americans, and also amateurs who bought guitars or who cranked Joannas in boozers and bashed out boogie and stride and blues. They played to old Dora in a floral hat and flat-capped chaps, jazz supple and wild enough to put ripples in their pints of mild. Many were bitten by the blues bug in the war years because of such encounters, not least the great Paul Oliver, whose eccentric English charm in its turn seemed to have earned him friendship from the practitioners of the form that had turned his head, and whose lively, non-partisan narrative and comment cements a sense of overview in a way without equal in the story of the blues and sequels. The Pacific counterpart to the hardy herd in Blighty had a mighty new thing with fins deadlier than the usual load, and from the bomb there would come a thunder, a nightmare black as slate, which this time would bring the planet to Hell's Gate. Then the gate was ajar, and all were aghast, and the world peeped and did not go through. Only 2 blighted, benighted cities knew. And in this white heat was to be forged the frigid steel of the Cold War. Many air bases would remain here on wet plains and switch to jet planes to play their roles in the showdown outside the saloon, where high noon was midnight, where the six-shooter was an analogue computer and a missile with a warhead fissile, where war's wounds had left a black blood clot, where everyone got mushrooms, whether they'd ordered them or not. And black shucks moan hardly phased the herds which grazed by the aerodromes. In 55, a spark had rose from Rosa Parks as she parked herself neat in a seat against racial mummery on a bus in Montgomery. In Mississippi, the same year, Emmett Till's blood spilled. A new Chicago blues would arrive in the 50s, electrified, plugged in and roughed back up for the new Delta diaspora, the great rural migration's latest iteration, who flocked to the perks of the steelworks. Elmore James's amplified slide would collide with the crying sky and bust the room with Dust My Broom. There was also Chester Burnett, who took lessons and tone from the master down home. This howling wolf, whose moon would rise at Sun Records, which had a surprise hit with a fellow Mississippian's cover of a blues song, The Titan from Tupelo, Elvis Presley. Howlin' Wolf would become a chess grandmaster and at last a snarling darling of the white college circuit who shook his bones with the Rolling Stones and lent his tones to Captain Beefheart's moans behind his trout mask replica, who lived to rage and raged to live like a blasted bird shrieking in a heavy gauge John Cage. And from Charlie P singing a shimmy she and tip-top hip-hop MC ODB's Shimmy Ya, it ain't that far. Only monumental blues Buddha Muddy Waters, who Lomax first put to wax, would rise higher than the high tide mark Howlin' Wolf left, in whose undertow thundered the recurrent pattern. A piece of Patton's guide abides in waters too, of course, this watercourse from the source, this current recurrent.
Blue Walker, the shadow, would show himself again. I would get closer to him, if need be, through the underworld places I was coming to know, where I knew moved the all-powerful hound dog black, who could stamp you out with one red-eyed look. We would meet, this man and I. We were star-crossed lovers, dance partners, duelists with an appointment in the misty dawn. I guessed he was no more powerful than I allowed him to be in my mind. He would make a sign. I was sure of that.
John Fay's pioneering academic work on Patton began with field research in Greenwood and Clarksdale in 1958. Folklorist and guitar player Fay would later satirise the sort of essayist he started out as, wishing a pox on orthodoxy. He had hunted for old records in the South before the influx of folk revivalists would spike as the 60s began to swing. Young researchers and searchers began to fan out into these enchanted backwoods of their own country and discovered that the America of Faulkner and Melville lived still, that the pain of Twain's sleep, which did not refresh, that very chase for the dollar, had put before the microphone some of the standalone artists from the underclasses. People born to stare at mules' arses as they ploughed, to live rotten and give cotton, to gouge minerals from the ground raw or hoe rows for the landlord. Here was a time capsule to fuel a renaissance, the rebirth of the cool. These far-out kids ventured at first not out, but back, through the pages of Kerouac whacked out on speed, back from the carport, TV dinners, rotissomats, to those woods and elves, to discover part of themselves in the alien places and old graces they found, to wells profound of the sweet and low down. Robert Crumb was another amateur record collector, and when he'd burst free of Haight-Ashbury and the underground comic scene, having been a keen record sleuth from his youth, would come to be a notable biographer of Charlie Patton. Crumb drew upon Robert Palmer's findings, who asserted in his famous book Deep Blues that the music was the mondo cantejondo, the deep song of the Deep South. During his life, Charlie Patton was a bigger beast than the Delta High Priest who imitated him, assimilated him, and then, tragically, half magically succumbed. The boys in the place think his drink was poison-laced. Robert Johnson had one regional hit in the ebullient Terraplane Blues. His legend was ennobled and celebrity went global with the arrival of the 1961 Columbia re-release. John Hammond Jr. had played Bob Dylan Johnson's music on the original and rare 78s, when the beat bard was going hard amid the glorious folk music spillage in Greenwich Village. Johnson was to become, through the Columbia release, the revivalist folk scene's Nazarene of the Delta Blues, the music newsman's bluesman go-to, the virtuosic poet who was to be played through and prayed to in the UK. Players like Brian Jones, Keith Richards and Eric Clapton, Joanne and Dave Kelly, Peter Green, Sam Mitchell, Ralph McTell, Rod Stewart and others. Inquisitive revisionists are revisiting, such as Elijah Wold, who makes bold in his insightful book, Escaping the Delta, about the welter of myth-making, which is still taking. The recurrent pattern of analysis or criticism of Patton's work seems to be schism. Hang your lights up high, for the way gets dark, and we could easily jump the shark. The masks are multiple. A man of the late 19th century who did his best, with some success, to live like a rock star of the late 20th. A man regarded as a definitive example of Delta blues, whose raw slide guitar markers and harsh new barkers took styles and foils not only from beyond the floodplain, but from beyond the state lines. The songs Patton pressed clearly express that he regularly used records for his inspiration, as was standard practice by then. The blues was being moulded, unfolded by the 78 and the accompanying patter of the advertising matter. Myths were made legend. The blues of blue jeans and insurance schemes and cans of pork and beans or beer started here. Da-na-na-na-na. The bed of information upon which this or any examination of Patton lies was made by those intrepid folklorists, archivists, collectors and enthusiasts. They traversed the bad lands of 60s Mississippi burning for the blues, the likes of Bernie Klatzko, Nick Pearls, Dick Waterman. Old sages took stages and wages, rolled back the decades to Patton's era, before the cocked ears and claps and cheers of young, mixed audiences. The blues revival was set to thrive during the fickle, febrile days when Old Black Joe and Jim Crow bowed low for what was hoped to be the death blow. The KKK hadn't gone away, but MLK dreamed aloud of a day when freedom would reign on the mountain and plain, where the Reconstruction pledges would rise again and be reprised again. The marchers turned to the spiritual and used the metaphysic of eternal salvation to sing of the metaphysic of integration. In 63, in DC. JFK's assassination obsessed the nation. Was it the Klan, the mob, an inside job, Cuban terror, human error? In 1964, the Civil Rights Bill to fulfil the oath to emancipate was put on the slate. Great. In 64, the war was won, or had a new battle begun? Kennedy's policy legacy in Vietnam would open a nasty can of harm for Uncle Sam, sworn in, drawn in to a fresh mock-up of the French cock-up, which broke hearts and minds with lies and the dead, and made home fires burn bright at the sight of the fright. Through that game-changing medium, educator, indoctrinator, mitigator of tedium, the silver screen was giving room to this upstart of the living room, the cathode ray of sunshine with the rabbit ears, which proffered dreams, fears, cheers, and undone years for loafers with gophers in loafers on sofas. You can pity or envy our ilk as I sit in my lair with a record player. I am at prayer. We monks of this funk, for whom there is a godhead of the blues, in whose pantheon stalks Johnson, House and Patton, we adherents of the recurrent pattern, we slatterns of the Charley Patton. There is a city on the edge of the never forever fen, where briefly spake a baked Nick Drake under a pink moon. He knew all about Samuel Johnson's black dog and Robert Johnson's hellhound, the canine of the mind which put him in the ground. Horror writer and fright inciter M.R. James dusted a witch's broom. M.R. knew as well as Elmore that if you don't want peaches, you shouldn't shake the tree, knew that to look too close at ghosts was to catch a dose of evil worse than any boll weevil. And long before his mates explored the dark side of the moon, the place where Sid Barrett lived as a lad, listening to Pink Anderson and Floyd Council, deeply smitten in Britain, the opening of the third eye to the music psychedelic was galvanised by idolising blues relics. We do hoodoo here too. East Anglia's ganglia is steeped in magic. The place where there was a stone cross on the village church and a salt cross in the window pane. The place where it once sufficed to add Christ and the Lamb of God to a pantheon from the aeons, where the ribbon of land gave the night sky a grandstand, and the beguiled night full made frightful by the wild hunt, mustered amid the punts and ditches where they once hunted witches. The place where black dogma once stalked like the hound of old Hades. The very ground underfoot, a kind of ghost loaned from the coast with pain and with costs, like the deltaic plain which put the mud into the blood in Patton's blue veins, the blues in the ooze which flanks the banks of the great ooze. Fated to be inundated, the place where there will be high water everywhere, where the levees will break and the sea will take back what was stolen. Small wonder Black Shuck shook those shacks with thatches built on nature's back taxes. Besieged by the sea, this war of ditches never relaxes, where the very air moans with the terms of the loan as the wind from the sea wails and the nor'easterly prevails, turns windmill sails for we inland sailors, impales us with its unfailing coldness and brings the Ural's chill through the window sill. The dog fiend, Scucker, the terrible one, the East Anglian cousin of the hellhound which followed close behind Robert Johnson's second mind, the canine vanguard of the last breath, the howling harbinger of death, on this flood plain of existence where the blues walks not like a man but lopes like a dog through the twilight fog. Could the stalking walker of the lowlands and crowlands, old Shuck, the black luck mutt, be the bluesman's best friend, as he is all life's constant companion? We can dread his silent tread or accept it. There is no end to the thread except it. The master of confusion and the ultimate conclusion, one of Patton's last illusions. The place where all life is led, the last jinx all around your bed. That contained in the beginning, which is all life's underpinning. The recurrent pattern of patterns. The end. Shall we dance?
Charlie Patton, though I don't wish to offend. Trying to work out what you're singing about drove me very nearly around the bend. And ladies and gents, if you think that the solo was minging, cop a load of this slightly awkward scat singing. Shoot-a-dee-ba-da-ba-da-ba-dee-ba-da-ba-bow, scat-a-bop-doo-doo-da-da, scat-a-bop-a-skeedly-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. He's running wild, that mighty boy, he's running wild. Oh yes indeed, oh how I grieve, that mighty boy, he's running wild. Thanks a bunch, Charlie Patton, now you have wrecked my life. 'Cause now I'm a blues man and I'll probably never get a wife. Thanks a bunch, Charlie Patton, you put me in your spell. I got a cheap day single ticket and is headed straight to hell. Thanks a bunch. Straight to hell, 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 thanks a bunch, man.